Running a business comes with a lot of what-ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku, and it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what-ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive, America's #1 motorcycle insurer. Everything is more exhilarating when you're on your motorcycle, just like your bike is more protected when you choose Progressive Motorcycle Insurance. They offer coverage for your bike, starting as low as $75 per year. And they keep things affordable, with discounts like paid in full, multi-policy, and responsible driver. So raise your kickstands and get to quoting at Progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. $75 premium is for state minimum coverage. Not available in D.C. Discounts not available in all states or situations.
Morning decisions. A creamy mocha frappuccino drink? A sweet vanilla? Maybe a smooth caramel? Or that white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Start your day with bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drinks. Pick up a bottle near you wherever you buy your groceries.
Hello, mega orderers. I am away on holiday in Europe. So, to discuss topics like the UK's relationship with the EU, how is Starmer doing at foreign policy, I turn to the initial co-hostists with the mostists, Alex and Arthur. I just want to set the scene here. They are going to be speaking about realism in Britain's foreign policy, and Arthur defines that very coherently in the way that that term is used popularly in newspapers and in British manifestos about foreign policy, i.e. that realism means a certain thing. Unfortunately, realism in the IR space means something quite different. So if you've listened to the early episodes of this podcast, you'll know that the enduring disorder paradigm that I came up with opposes realist IR theory because realist IR theory postulates that states maximize their interests and that the role of foreign policy is to make decisions to maximize your interests. When I say realism, that's what I mean by it. Unfortunately, when David Lammy says realism, or when Arthur is critiquing David Lammy's progressive realism, that's not what he means. So my critique is that there's a psychological component whereby Trump makes decisions which are not in the U.S. national interest, and Putin makes decisions which are not in Russia's national interests. That's my critique of realism. The critique of realism that you're going to hear from Arthur and Alex is really neither here nor there on that debate because they're debating the more popular way in which realism is used. Sorry for that complexity. And here we are with Arthur and Alex. Take it away.
I'm Alex Hall.
And I'm Arthur Snell, and this is Disorder, a podcast where we try to find order in our mad world.
And every week I feel like we need to add a few more mads to that introduction, since every week the world seems to be a little bit more disordered and a little bit more mad. But in today's episode, we're going to try to take a step back and not just focus on today's crazy, but look at British diplomacy over the last year, since we are recording this almost a year to the day since the Labour government came into office. What has changed and what has stayed the same in British diplomacy? What do we think about David Lammy's concept of progressive realism as his guiding tenet for applying to British foreign policy? And we're going to offer a grade point for each area of British foreign policy. If we were grading Starmer's government on foreign policy, how do we think they're doing? And what would we like them to be doing better or different? So Arthur, you and I are both former British diplomats.
Indeed.
We keep in touch with our former colleagues. We've had experience, in my case, from the 1980s onwards. I think you're a little bit younger, but you're based in London and closer to the heart of British foreign policy. I'm now based in America, looking at it from outside the UK. So I think we'll bring some interesting perspectives to this discussion. So buckle up, people. Here we go. All right, so welcome everybody to this episode of Disorder, where we take a look at British diplomacy over the past year. And I'm going to be putting Arthur in the hot seat and asking him to kick us off with his view of David Lammy, the current British Foreign Secretary, his concept of progressive realism as the kind of guiding framework for British foreign policy. What do you think of it, Arthur?
Well, I think it's important to start off by being clear what it means. So obviously, in foreign policy terms, realism can mean literally a kind of pragmatic, realistic approach to what the world is. But it's also come to mean something slightly more technical, which is an approach to foreign affairs that countries pursue a fairly narrow and sort of hard analysis of their national interest, and perhaps downplay the importance of sort of high-flown ideological ideas. And actually, in recent years, realism has taken a bit of a sort of drubbing because realists in various foreign policy circles have argued that perhaps Russia should be allowed to dominate its neighbourhood, because that would effectively sort of leave Russia satisfied and feeling secure, and we shouldn't do things like try to get Ukraine into the European Union or NATO. Now, that's not the debate we're having here, but it's just important to be aware of that, because I think the concept of realism is potentially a little bit of a tarnished brand. But to move on to what Lammy himself is talking about, I think it's actually quite productive, because in a way it is the polar opposite of the rather farcical idea of global Britain, which of course was Boris Johnson's idea, that Britain was big and successful and was a player on the global stage. Now, that's easy to say, but when you say, yes, but what does that mean? What will we do? How will we be global? There was no answer to that. Whereas progressive realism starts from an assumption that we have to come to terms with the reality of what Britain is in the 2020s. And in fact, in the article that David Lammy sort of wrote to set out these theories, coming to terms is the sort of first part of his article. So I think it starts from a really sensible place, which is that Britain in the 2020s is not the Britain of the colonial era, but it's not even the Britain of the early 21st century when Tony Blair was in power, when we had a bigger economy than China then. Well, we obviously don't now. So I think a lot of things have changed, and it starts from that place.
All right, thank you for that, Arthur. I kind of feel that progressive realism is cakeism. It's having your cake and eating it. And I think it's a really good description of this government's foreign policy, which is cautious, avoiding hard choices, playing it safe, unambitious, and low impact, from which you can deduce that I'm not particularly impressed by it, but I do think it's realistic based on today's current challenges. And, as you quoted David Lammy, coming to terms with the reality of Britain's situation in the world and taking a clear-eyed view of what we actually can achieve and the powers we have to achieve it. And the reason I say it's cakeist is because it's trying to be two things at once. It's trying to play to the wing that says we have to be realistic and hard-headed and clear-eyed about the challenges, and we can't afford all this wishy-washy, idealistic nonsense about human rights or democracy. You know, regime change is a flawed notion, and we just have to be more hard-headed. But it's also keeping the word progressive in to reassure the more liberal, idealistic trend of foreign policy. But we're still committed to international law, we believe in values and standards, and we do care about these things. So it's trying to marry two concepts that actually have always been in tension with each other. Now, I'm not saying that's a wrong thing to do. I think it's been the eternal debate in foreign policy, balancing these two tensions which sometimes come into tension with each other. For example, in our relationship with Saudi Arabia, we do care about human rights in Saudi Arabia, but we also sell them arms. And that's always been a tension. We do care about human rights in authoritarian regimes, but we sometimes end up cooperating with them on counter-terrorism, for example, during the war on terror. So I think it's a kind of cakeist philosophy that allows you to justify different decisions at different times. And sometimes the progressive international law values part is going to come to the fore, and sometimes the realism has come to the fore. So that's how I would define it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair criticism. I suppose what I would say is that the era that the last period of obviously of a Labour government in power was the Blair era. And that was clearly the era of the kind of liberal interventionism. And as we both know all too well, we started with the war in Kosovo, which at the time most people thought was entirely justified. And we ended with the war in Iraq, which was disastrous. And even at the time, there were very serious arguments about its legality. And further on from there, regime change in Libya, for which there were no plans for the post-Gaddafi Libya. And so there is a need, perhaps, for a British government, particularly a British government of the left, to set out the ways in which it is not going to repeat those sort of disastrous precedents. But I also think perhaps there's a bigger point here, which is that certainly for most of my professional life, British governments would make assumptions that Britain is a country that can change things at a global level. So obviously with alliances, but we would want to be involved in the invasion of Iraq because we felt that we were a player on the global stage. We would want to be a participant in major world-changing events. And I think the realism which we're seeing now is partly the realism of the declining power and reach of Britain, so that we know that we're not going to be on our own or even in small coalitions making these massive global differences. We now know that we are dealing with the world as we find it and perhaps doing our best to try to mitigate the worst things in it and where possible to work with others to make changes. But I think there's less of that kind of messianic approach that one saw particularly with Blair, that he really felt like he was somebody who could change the world.
So that's a really good framing. That's a definition of realism, about being more realistic about what we can achieve and the limits of our power, rather than it being realism in the sense of we're just going to be sort of hard-headed and, ruthless in pursuit of our national interest, values be damned. That's a better framing of it. Of course, that is bound to provoke some criticism, especially from the Conservative and the sort of traditional hawkish wing, who would say, this is doing down the UK, we're a great power, this is undermining what we should be. But the people who tend to make those arguments are also those who advocated for withdrawing from the EU, which was a key multiplier of British power and influence in the world and has made us less influential and poorer as a result. So there is you should be able to see off those critiques, but it does lend itself to the accusation that we have declined in impact. All right, let's turn to specific areas of foreign policy. Let's start with UK-US relations, because certainly for my time as a British diplomat, that kind of anchored everything. If you define foreign policy primarily as being about national security, first and foremost, it's about the security of your nation, then the UK-US relationship, and through that into NATO, was the kind of anchor there. So how do you see this government as having done, and if you can give it a grade, in managing UK-US relations with this very mercurial, unpredictable President Trump pursuing America first?
Yeah, I think I would sort of give it a B+. So
that's what I had too.
Oh, right. Well, that
Great.
great minds clearly think
Okay.
alike. So let's talk about the positives. Keir Starmer has managed to create what appears to be a good relationship with Donald Trump. And that is not easy to do. And particularly if you are a leftist, technocratic, former prosecutor with a background in human rights, an earlier background in radical politics, albeit, Keir Starmer's gone on quite a journey since then. But there's almost nothing about Keir Starmer that he has in common with Donald Trump. I can't believe they find things to talk about very easily. There isn't golf. There isn't, what's your favorite private jet? Everything about them is so different that it's impossible to imagine. And Keir Starmer doesn't have an easy charm about him. He's quite an awkward person. So he's obviously worked incredibly hard to do this, and we have to give him credit. And obviously he's never going to say this publicly, but I'm sure he has a fairly similar view of Donald Trump that most progressives had, whether it's about Trump's personality or the inadequacies of his policies, which we could enumerate. Trump's foreign policies, the abandonment of Ukraine, the sort of mercurial approach to the Middle East. So I think it's incredibly difficult. And the risk with Trump, people talk, I think, slightly foolishly about the Love Actually moment. And of course, this is the movie where Hugh Grant stands up to a sort of boorish US president and British people kind of spring to their feet and applaud him. But back in the real world, well, one, prime ministers don't look like Hugh Grant. And secondly, doing that really gets you nowhere, because particularly when you have someone like Trump, Trump is vindictive. He will use all the resources of the US state, its trading power, its strategic power, its military power. He will use all that just to get at someone who he thinks has, mildly offended him. So in that sense, I think Starmer has done a very good job. Now, the reason I'm not giving him an A- or an A or whatever is that doesn't mean that we have to say yes to everything that the Americans ask for. And it doesn't mean that we should give them everything the first time they ask. So, for example, if we know that the thing that Trump really wants, really, is to go and see the king and have tea at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle or whichever other royal palace it might be, then that shouldn't be the thing that you give him on your first visit across the Atlantic when you first meet Donald Trump. I mean, you might talk about it, you might warmly suggest that it's in the pipeline, but to sort of issue the invitation, it's a classic example that if, you play your best card, you can't play it later. Similarly, I think with the so-called trade deal, which was a grand trade deal between the UK and the US, it turns out it was an agreement to start negotiating on a sectoral agreement. So it's an agreement to have a negotiation. But by definition, by being the first country to define those terms, it's as likely as not that we'll get some of the worst terms, because you sort of set the baseline upon which other countries will seek to build their own trade and other economic objectives. So I think there is a risk of being overly compliant. There's a risk of appearing always to be saying yes. And I think there's a risk ultimately that Trump clearly admires strength. The people he admires are not the people who are nice to him. Netanyahu has repeatedly humiliated America, repeatedly ignored America, pursued his own agenda at the expense of American interests. And yet Trump admires Netanyahu and, of course, admires Vladimir Putin way more than he admires anyone who's been elected to office. And I'm not saying then that we should encourage our leaders to behave like Putin and Netanyahu, but there is something to be learnt from that style. So I think that's my where I come down on this particular point.
Wow, you've covered so many of the points that I also had jotted down on this. And like I said, I came out in the same grade, which is B+. And my very first comment under that heading was going to be that it's actually quite impressive that Starmer has established a personal relationship with Trump. I would expand the areas in which that has actually been helpful. I don't disagree with you about the dangers of appearing to give Trump what he wants, of appearing to fawn too much upon him, the sort of slightly nauseating spectacle of this amazing historic deal, the UK-US trade deal, and the sort of handing over of the letter. But it does show real diligence. It shows an effort to figure out what appeals to Trump. And however tempting it is to blow Trump off, the bottom line is that our security still depends upon our relationship with the US. And even if at some stage down the road we have to drift further apart, we need to keep the relationship going, because the UK is not going to build up its own defense capability for many years to come. So I kind of feel that however nauseating and risky that sort of compliant posture has been, it's been a necessary step. So I give him credit for that. And I also feel it's paid dividends in other ways. For example, I have heard from more than one source that after the disastrous Oval Office meeting between Trump and Zelensky, actually Starmer played a massive role behind the scenes in trying to patch that up and stop the US abandoning Ukraine altogether. And getting US backing for the Diego Garcia deal is quite an achievement as well. So I feel it has produced some dividends, and I feel that Starmer relationship with a junior partner, it involves some nauseating requirement to sort of kowtow a bit to Trump, but I feel it has had some impact as well. So I think it's a B+, but Trump could have a tantrum and change his mind at any moment. And if the UK ever does decide to stand up for stronger red lines or international law, or to try and stand up to the US on something where the US is going down a path we really can't accept, that could all be blown off. So it's a B+. I think it's on the positive side, managing a very difficult situation, but it's incredibly delicate. It's a diplomatic minefield every single week.
Yeah. And I think if we compare Starmer's relationship to that of other comparable Western leaders, so, the easy comparison might be Macron in France, who at times has had extremely close relations with Trump. Trump was still unbelievably rude about him in the sort of margins of the G7, when in fact, Macron had not criticized Trump, or really, Macron had tried to cover for Trump and say that Trump had a good reason to leave early. Yet, Trump went off on one. So I think, as we're both agreeing here, it's an incredibly difficult thing to do, to be a leader of a mid-sized democracy in the era of Trump.
Just out of interest, there's no date been fixed for the state visit, has there? So that's a little card up the sleeve, isn't it?
I think that's right. And I've understood, I wouldn't claim to be on the real inside of this, but I've understood that the Americans have been putting pressure to get a date in the diary. And His Majesty, who, of course, is King of Canada and has made it very clear that he, as you'd expect him to, is very supportive of Canada. And it's right to be an independent nation. It seems extraordinary we're talking about that as if it's in doubt. But, that's where we are. Maybe His Majesty has not yet felt the need to commit to a date.
Yeah, well, His Majesty is very busy. And he's also ill as well.
Yes, yes, exactly. There's other factors in the mix.
Yeah, so I was in the embassy here during the first Trump presidency, and I remember organising the previous Trump visits to the UK. And I mean, the effort that went into trying to make sure it was a success. And there was one time when Trump visited the UK and he appeared to have this successful meeting with Theresa May. And then he went out and a few hours later was going on about what a great guy Nigel Farage was and how he'd make an excellent future prime minister. And it's like, oh my God. I mean, so it's very risky. Okay, let's move to the next area, UK-EU relations. Where do you grade them?
I would actually give it a pretty low grade, so probably a C, maybe a C-. And I think, obviously, there has recently been a reset. This includes some limited arrangements on sort of aligning some of our kind of food and other products, and not a youth mobility deal, but a sort of arrangement that will make it possible for certain young people to move around the continent. And so, yes, it's the sort of bare minimum that you could do to get things going. But I think if we just take a step back from that, obviously there are a lot of people who are politically where I am, regretful Remainer types who want this government to be much more ambitious in its relations with the European Union, not just because of the cultural elitism of liking Europe, but actually for pure economic reasons. Britain does not have a competitive or productive economy at the moment, and we've shut ourselves off one way or another from our biggest market right on our doorstep. It seems to me that there are two things at play here. One is the extraordinary caution of this Labour government, which, yes, of course, within the traditional Labour movement, there's a lot of Euroscepticism. Yes, of course, the so-called Red Wall had plenty of constituencies that voted for Brexit. But what we also know is that loads of people that voted for Brexit now are of the view that Brexit hasn't worked. You add into the fact that in addition to the immense majority that the Labour Party has in the House of Commons, you've got, for the first time since before World War II, over 70 Lib Dem MPs, all of whom, of course, are on a kind of pro-Europe platform. You've got then a smattering of Greens. So if you added up the sort of pro-European voices in Parliament, it is an absolutely massive tidal wave of kind of parliamentary heft. And what seems to me disappointing is that I understand if we were 6 months before a general election, perhaps with Nigel Farage riding high in the polls, you'd need to be very cautious. But they had an opportunity at the start of the Parliament to move quickly. And the reason to do this, again, to reiterate, would be to give our economy a boost, and in so doing, make their winning of the next election far easier. Where it seems to me that what you risk having now, which is very Starmer, I think, is this overly cautious approach, which will result in sluggish growth in our economy, which will then gift the next election to Farage and Reform anyway, or certainly risks doing that. And so that's why I give them a low grade.
Yeah, I was a little bit more generous. I had a B minus.
Okay.
Because I think the overall nature of our relationship with Europe has been put on a much better pathway with Keir Starmer. I think the hosting of the European political community within weeks of him coming into office immediately marked a different atmosphere, different tone. There was none of the sort of petty insults that people like Liz Truss used to give to the Europeans. There was no sort of constant sniping of the EU. There's clearly a much, much better relationship. And if you think about it as not just about the EU and Brexit, but about the UK just working with its European partners in a much better way, I think, again, we see it in all sorts of ways. We see it on Ukraine, we see it on Russia, we see it, I assume the UK talks quite a lot with our European partners about the relationship with the US and Donald Trump and handling sort of geopolitical challenges. So even if we haven't formally rejoined some elements of the EU, of course not the customs union, the single market, or re-established formal foreign policy and security dialogue, actually substantively we are working far more closely with our European partners. So that's why I put it in the B category. But like you, I feel they have shied away from taking the much bigger jump, which is to actually say, we really need to reset in a much more ambitious way some of what was done in Brexit. We should embrace a youth mobility. We should try and push for closer economic ties again, because it's been so clearly self-harming to our economy. And in this moment of rising geopolitical tensions, and especially when even things like the American commitment to NATO are looking more shaky, we have to. National security begins with having a stronger national economy. And the other mantra of this government is economic growth. And we can't achieve that unless we improve our trading relationships with the EU. So that's where the minus comes in for me. And I'm disappointed. And I think that the factors you have said are absolutely correct. They are still frightened of the Red Wall, frightened of challenging the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, the kind of media narrative on Brexit that portrays any cooperation with the EU as a concession, as somehow we've lost out. I mean, but I feel that a more charismatic, better communicating, confident leader would have taken the argument to these papers, would have taken the argument to the British people and say, we have to have a proper, more honest discussion about where Brexit has left us. And I really worry. I'm a member of various European groups. I'm a patron of the European movement. I speak to European grassroots organisations. I'm regularly invited to engage with these kind of groups. And what I hear through sort of back channels, there is still, in our two main political parties, which are still just the Conservatives and Labour, a failure to really understand what the European project is about. There's still this sort of zero-sum mentality, this sense that the UK is somehow special and different, and that European countries owe us and they ought to do something for us, and they ought to allow special terms for the UK, and that we should be able to cherry pick. I still think there is a failure to understand how the EU works and what the project was designed to achieve. And I find that very disappointing. I think the Lib Dems and the Greens have a better concept of that, but there is still this notion of exceptionalism which colours the UK's approach to the EU. That's not the same as our approach to Europe. So going back to my earlier remarks, I do think there is a substantively better relationship with Europe. But we haven't got over some of the mindset and the ideological blinkers that blind us to what the nature of the EU is.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think there is this thing about the allowing a very narrow and frankly dying corner of the media. What we're talking about is daily newspapers that are read by people of a right-wing perspective and usually fairly elderly people, allowing that very small little segment of the media to completely dominate this debate. And I mean, the fact that people still talk about whether or not there'll be a deal on fishing, just to remind people that the entire fishing industry in Britain is equivalent to a very small market town somewhere in the countryside. You know, it's not even a medium-sized town. And that's just one little tiny industry. And yet we're sort of holding up really important things that could change the lives of millions of people in this country on the basis of some of these really sort of outdated concepts. So the cherry picking, this outdated idea, and it comes back to actually to the point of progressive realism. Progressive realism would start with recognizing the basic trading ideas, such as that your main trading partners are on your doorstep and you need to make it as easy as possible to trade with them before you start worrying about whether or not you've got a trade deal with India.
Yeah, so they've also allowed the debate still to be framed by the people who pushed for Brexit.
Yeah.
So you're in the C, possibly C minus. I'm in the B minus. We might compromise on C overall.
All right. Yeah.
A C
okay.
grade. Okay. Let's turn to NATO and defence then. We are recording this just a few weeks after the UK's new Strategic Defence Review came out, and on the day that its national security strategy was released, which the headline that all the papers have picked up on is that the UK must prepare for the potential of a wartime scenario in the UK homeland, that we are facing a multitude of new threats, and also we are talking on the day that the NATO summit is about to start, and Keir Starmer has for the first time said that the UK will aspire to reach 5% GDP spending on defence by 2035, which is over 2 elections away. So that's pushing it quite a long way away. How would you grade them on NATO and defence?
I think I'd give them a fairly positive grade because let's start with, unlike the Europe relations where effectively they have all the levers they need, on defence, the levers are really quite limited. We're already committed, for example, to supporting Ukraine, and we might talk about that later. We've gifted, rightly in my view, many weapons to Ukraine. The preceding government had underfunded the military over a prolonged period, degraded it. The issues with inefficient procurement, a culture within UK defence that, again, it's a sort of UK exceptionalism that that ordinary defence equipment isn't good enough for the British soldier and we must have something very expensive and prone to break. And so all those things come into play, and at the end of which our national defence is a bit dysfunctional at the moment. And of course, as we all know, the army, smaller than at any time since the Napoleonic War, when the population of this country was a fraction of what it is now. So given all those challenges, I think they've done a pretty good job. They took a very tough decision to raise defence spending by stripping the aid budget. I think I would have argued that there were other ways to have funded that, but at least it showed an absolute determination to get moving on this. And as you say, they've made this longer term commitment to reach 5%. Now, the NATO sort of stretch target of 5% is worth noting that it's a slightly, they've sort of changed the rule book slightly, which will make it easier for countries to allocate a wider range of spending to defence. And so when you get towards that 5% number, you're sort of counting more things that might previously, certain infrastructure, for example, might previously have come under civilian infrastructure. So I think they've done a fair job. I guess this is one where if I would probably give them something quite solid, like an A-, but I think if 3 years from now, when we're hard up against the next election, actually things have not moved, the army hasn't got bigger, we haven't resolved some of these procurement issues, then that grade might slip back a little.
So I struggled with where to grade this. I think I'm a little bit more critical, as you sketch out very persuasively in your review, that we are facing unprecedented times and we need to prepare for war. Then you actually need to put the money towards that, which means you need to join the dots, which means you do need to recognise that we need to improve our trading relationship with the EU. So on pretty much every subject that we've covered so far, if you look at it in narrow terms, it's been getting by, it's been threading the needle, it's not been making too many mistakes. If you look at it in bigger terms, sometimes I feel we've done better than is recognised, but sometimes I think we're falling a little bit short. And that's how I feel about defence. If this really is such a moment, then we have to find the money. And that means we have to apply more rigour at home in the amount of money we spend on areas like the NHS. We need to reform the NHS. We need to reform entitlements. We can't afford such extravagant social security. Or you need to raise taxes, or ideally all three. You need to really pursue better trade with our nearest and dearest trading partner, which is the EU, and you need to communicate that. And perhaps that's an overarching theme. I don't think this government has done a good job of communicating the nature of the world that we are in. I think there is a lack of really compelling narrative here that brings home to the British people. And so domestically, they're getting attacked for taking money from UK aid, which of course is very disappointing. I'm sure there's going to be disappointments about not being so ambitious on green targets. There's going to be disappointment about not spending even more money on the NHS or social security. There's criticism about taking the winter fuel allowance. There's criticism about disability benefits. So I don't underestimate. There's criticism about the woeful state of public services, the need to invest in British infrastructure. These are all problems that have been accumulating for years. And you were talking about Tony Blair and his sort of messianic personality. I mean, Tony Blair came to power in quite a prosperous and better time.
Yeah. It was a bit easier to go around spending money then.
But he had the character and the ability to speak to the British people about big things. And I think carry the British people with him. He wouldn't have won so many elections. He overreached in Iraq. But we need that kind of ability to sketch out the nature of the world we're in and the hard choices that are facing our country domestically and internationally. And I think we're not making those hard choices. So I'm a little bit more critical on NATO and defence. I'm glad we're trying to spend more money. I recognise he inherited a lousy situation. But you're now the ones in charge. You have to make the case.
BTW, FYI. Visit Nexplanon.com/RN to learn about Nexplanon. It's an adjustable implant, 68 milligrams radiopaque. Or ask your HCP IRL. Okay, TTYL.
This is History's Heroes. People with purpose, brave ideas, and the courage to stand alone, including a pioneering surgeon who rebuilt the shattered faces of soldiers in the First World War.
You know, he would look at these men and he would say, "Don't worry, Sonny, you'll have as good a face as any of us when I'm done with you."
Join me, Alex von Tunzelmann, for History's Heroes. Subscribe to History's Heroes wherever you get your podcasts.
This one, I think, personally, is a more positive area. It's the area I give them an A, which is Ukraine and Russia. But I'm jumping the gun. What do you think?
No, I'm with you, and there's a risk of us agreeing too much. But I think there was never too much doubt about the degree to which there would be continuity on Ukraine between the Conservative government and now. Funnily enough, I think there were questions over some in the Tory party in their past having been rather open to Russian money and that sort of thing. But when it came to the crunch, the Ukrainian cause is just very, very popular with the British people. So it would be a bold politician who tried to sort of take that on and push against that. So we could then talk about whether it's the right policy. In my view, it's absolutely the right policy. I feel very strongly about this, and I'm sure you do too, Alex, that we are supporting Ukraine because it's the right thing to do morally, but it's strategically, in a hard realism sense, to be confronting the extraordinary threat of a really rampantly aggressive Russia, where we've got to now as opposed to where we might have been 10 or 15 years ago. Of course, we have to give Ukraine as much support as we can. And I think Starmer understood early on, probably, that one of his biggest challenges would be to reassure the Ukrainians that a change of government. Starmer had a need to reassure the Ukrainians and reassure Zelensky personally. And I think he's done that. And as you said earlier, in fact, played an important role in recovering the relationship between the US and Ukrainians after the disastrous White House ambush, which, of course, Trump and J.D. Vance took part in right at the start of the Trump presidency. So I think that there are a lot of things about the Ukraine relationship which have been really good. And even when we've had the, frankly, rather ghastly spectacle of Trump effectively trying to hand victory to the Russians, Starmer, I think, has played quite a strong game of appearing to be helpful to the Americans and talking about a coalition of the willing, whilst not actually diverting from the core point that we continue to support Ukraine. So, yeah, I'm happy with our Ukraine policy. I think it would be great if we could give more. We don't have that much more to give. I mean, that's a problem because we haven't done enough to fill up our own arms stocks. And this is, it's a classic thing. If someone doesn't want to give you something, I say, I'd love to, but I haven't got anything to give. But we're getting a bit close to that in the UK. The difference, though, is, of course, in that time, the Ukrainians have built up their own arms industry, both drones and conventional arms, artillery and so on. So this is not to say that Ukraine has got an easy ride ahead of it. Quite the contrary. But I think we are part of a really strong coalition and holding together that coalition with France and Germany in particular, which is so important.
Yeah, so I agree with everything you've said there. And I think this has been a really strong area, which is why I give it an A. I think I'm not going to repeat everything that you have said, but I will frame it back to this wider story, which is I think the UK has played a helpful role in working with the US on Ukraine and working very well with European partners on Ukraine. And the UK also continues to play, it's a niche role, but, we have our troops in Estonia, we have new defense arrangements with various Nordic states, we have a good relationship with the Poles. This is where we don't necessarily work with the EU, but we do have good relationships across Europe, and the UK is a valuable player there. And then I think Starmer has been able to leverage his relationship with Donald Trump to good effect. So I think this has been a really strong area of performance. What I would say, however, is it's also been politically the easiest one.
Yeah.
So for me, it begs the question, does the government actually have a real vision Or is everything just political calculation?
And I think this point about, I don't think Starmer would ever attempt to be a persuader of the British public. He analyses data, finds out what people think already, and then figures out policies that sort of work in the grain of that. And one might say, oh, well, that's how politics works. But actually, as you've attested to, really effective politicians, and of course Blair is one, but there are others, one could think of Barack Obama notably, are able to articulate a vision and persuade people that what they're talking about makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, so progressive realism, it's a sort of a functional term. It describes how you will approach things, but it doesn't actually describe what you will do and where you see the UK. And I've often thought for years, I mean, that British diplomacy had become too skilled at the process of diplomacy, writing good speeches, drafting good documents, finding the bon mot which bridges a divide and gets a UN resolution, or when we were in the EU, just crafts a consensus. We had become very skilled at the art of diplomacy. But I wasn't always sure, but what did we actually ourselves believe? We're sort of navigating, how do we bring the US and the EU together? Where's the US? Where's the EU? So where should we be? But what's our sort of actual own independent view? Now, you could say, well, that's just realism. And you could say, this is just a sensible, moderate, realistic foreign policy. And it falls short in some ways because we're not the great power that we were once. So it's a realistic foreign policy. It's a more humble foreign policy. But I do sometimes wonder, looking at all these themes as I was preparing for this episode, it does leave me questioning, but what do we ourselves actually believe in? And that brings me to the last area I'm going to ask about, which is the Middle East, and where you would rate our performance on the Middle East.
I mean, I think this has been a very disappointing area, and one can understand some of the context and reasons that led us here. Let's recall that Keir Starmer took over the Labour Party in the midst of a really awful row about anti-Semitism. And, the Labour Party had been found by Britain's own Equalities Commission to have sort of dropped the ball on anti-Semitism. So there was lots to grapple with, and one can completely understand how Starmer ended up where he ended up. But it was pretty grim to see a human rights lawyer of some repute, it happened to be the Prime Minister of the UK, failing to appreciate what was rather quickly happening in the Israel-Gaza conflict, where obviously Hamas committed a heinous massacre on October the 7th, 2023, but very quickly this morphed into effectively a sort of collective punishment campaign by Netanyahu's government against the Palestinians in Gaza, all kinds of activities which seem to be very clearly war crimes of one sort or another, whether we're talking about starvation, whether we're talking about the shooting of civilians, whether we're talking about the denial of aid, medical aid, restricting media access. There are so many ways in which basic ideas of sort of humanity and international law have been ripped up. And we've chosen really to do the barest minimum about it. And what's interesting about this is that when, for example, not this time around, but last year, when Israel was targeted by Iran in a major missile strike, British military planes took to the air to defend Israel. And I would say that was the right thing to have done. And let's not forget the Jordanians were involved, the French were involved. So this wasn't just Britain sort of out on a limb with the Americans. This was part of quite a concerted international step. But when on occasion, on rare occasions, we have been seen by Netanyahu to have fallen foul of what he wants us to do, he's accused us of aligning ourselves with Hamas anyway. So the idea that you have to behave in this way in order to be able to sort of maintain your strong relationship with the Israelis isn't true. Netanyahu will hurl insults at you if he doesn't get what he wants every day. So that isn't a debate. Another thing that is not in debate is actually us being aligned with our allies. The French have been far more critical. There are European countries which we are very close to geopolitically, take Sweden, that have already moved a long way down the road in terms of calling out what's been happening, talking about recognition of a Palestinian state and so on. So I don't really understand what is going on here. And interestingly, yes, of course, there's a domestic political point about not allowing the shadow of anti-Semitism to cloud our relations on Israel in particular. But let us not also forget that plenty of people in this country of Arab heritage, plenty of people of Muslim faith who feel that their perspective has been completely dismissed. Now, you don't have to be a Muslim to feel upset about what's happening in Gaza. That's not what I'm suggesting. But the idea that there's a sort of hard political calculus here doesn't even seem to stand up. So, frankly, I think it comes down to a traditional British reticence in calling out Israel. But actually, I think sometimes just a moral failure. I think this has been a moral failure and one which, sadly, we will be talking about for years to come. But in the years to come, it would have been too late to have done something about it.
Yeah. So also today, I read an interview with Lord Richard Hermer, who is the UK Attorney General,
yes,
in which he said commitment to international law is at the heart of this government's approach to foreign policy. And it's just not true. And this, for me, puts to the test this progressive realism notion, because, like you, it seems to me absolutely extraordinary how we have not been more critical and more forceful in calling out Israel's action in Gaza. Almost 2 years into the conflict, we're over 600 days into this now. Any of us who criticize Israel, we are always at pains to try and make clear. All of us recognize the heinous nature, not just of Hamas's attack on the 7th of October. I mean, Hamas has never recognized Israel. They've always wanted to attack Israelis. They've been committing atrocities for years. So, I mean, they are up against a very evil foe. Nevertheless, what we are now witnessing in Gaza, it is just sheer mind-blowing, the scale of the devastation, the scale of the atrocities. Yes, terrible things happen in war, but they don't happen day after day after day after day. There has to be a deliberate calculation behind it. You can't set up an aid distribution point and have dozens of Palestinians killed there every single day. This has just gone way beyond the initial raison d'etre for trying to push out Hamas. I mean, this is an indiscriminate attack on an entire population, and it is collective punishment of an entire Palestinian population. So many norms of international humanitarian law have been violated. And as you said, Keir Starmer is someone who is intimately experienced in human rights. He is an international human rights expert. And so I find it absolutely appalling that we have not been more critical. We've slapped on a few sanctions. We've uttered a bit of criticism here and there. But this is where I feel we have failed the test that Richard Hermer put out, that international law is at the heart of British foreign policy. It manifestly has not been when it's come to the Middle East. And like you, I don't know what's behind it. I think there is a fear of Israel that has just pervaded us. There is a tradition of support for Israel. It's embedded in our consciousness. Iran bad, Hamas bad, Hezbollah bad, Houthis bad. Israel is a democracy, therefore we support democracy. But those notions were set up when Israel was a vulnerable country surrounded by very hostile Arab states who did attack Israel repeatedly. But Israel's survivability is not in question anymore. Israel is overridingly the strongest military power in the Middle East. It is a nuclear power, something which is often overlooked. It has very strong support. It has immense capabilities. And even its very democracy is in question right now because they treat Palestinians as second-class citizens, and its viability as a democratic state is in question when it's oppressing so clearly the people in territories it has occupied for 20 or 30 years. And so I don't understand why we have not spoken out more forcefully on this. And what's interesting to me is we're recording this episode on the day that Donald Trump himself uttered a remark, which I thought Donald Trump, occasionally he blunders out truths. And he said, Israel and Iran, I can't remember the exact words, but he said, Israel and Iran, they just keep fighting each other. They don't even know what for anymore. They just keep attacking each other. And there was a sort of a degree of truth in that. He actually was calling out both sides, this sort of tit for tat. And I'm certainly not giving any excuses for the Iranian regime. And as is my wont, when you look at Israel versus Gaza, I now feel what Israel's doing is way beyond the pale in Gaza. But when you look at the strategic situation, I don't have a huge amount of sympathy for the Iranian regime, which has fostered terrorist proxies around the region. So you have to sort of look at it in bigger and bigger themes. But if ethics and foreign policy and international law is going to be a lodestar in our foreign policy, we have manifestly failed when it's come to the Palestinians. So I give them a D here.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely fair. And I agree with you. I mean, this point about international law, there's a temptation to fall into the trap of saying, well, international law's died and we can't do anything about it. Now, I think at the sort of macro level, that is unfortunately true. But there are still things that matter. And so to have a country carrying out war crimes in a very transparent way, Netanyahu has said now that the expulsion of the entire population of Gaza is a reasonable objective. That's not a thing that we might find out if we sort of carry out a spying operation and we find this big secret. This is a thing that's being said publicly. We know that this aid distribution program, which is being run by a private company in concert with the Israeli government, is resulting in regular massacres at food distribution plants. So again, none of this is a secret. And it seems to me very strange that we're still sort of mincing our words and not really prepared to talk frankly about what's going on. And so all of these things play into a wider sense, perhaps, of what you were talking about, of we don't really know why our policy is that. We're perfectly good at, organising conferences or lobbying or getting a UN Security Council resolution across the line, but we don't know why we're doing it. And I think if we look at what's happened in the Middle East, that's really writ large.
All right. I think we should take a break now. After the break, Arthur and I will try to order the disorder. What would we like this government to do differently in foreign policy? All right, so welcome back, mega orderers. In the tail end of this episode, having ripped apart and dissected British foreign policy, Arthur and I are going to put forward our wish list for what we wish they would do differently. Arthur, you go first.
Well, some of the things I'm going to say in a way are rather easy, so I can say them quickly, is I think be more ambitious in our relationship with Europe. Do it now so that we reap the benefits in time for the election, because I want to show that I'm not a typical diplomat with no idea about electoral cycles and all those sorts of things. So do it that way. I think we're doing the right thing in Ukraine, but again, we could be more ambitious. We really need to make sure that we are shoring up the kind of European lines of defence. And then perhaps just to touch on areas that we haven't really had the chance to talk about, I think there's a lot to be done with the global south, particularly sub-Saharan Africa, where the combination of the climate crisis and actually expanding economies means you've got huge population growth, and that brings with it lots of opportunity, but of course it brings with it challenge. And I think we need, in a way that I think actually the Blair governments were able to do rather successfully, it's not just about resources, it's about engagement. I don't see evidence of really sort of strong engagement from the top of our government, particularly with Africa, and I think we need more of that. And obviously Africa is a vast continent, but that means engagement with countries like Nigeria, countries like South Africa, countries like Kenya, the big players in the continent. So I think those are some of the things. The final thing I'd say, and this is, if listeners have a sort of cynical snort at this point, they're entitled to, is we need to spend more on diplomats. The Foreign Office, year after year, sees its budget squeezed and squeezed and squeezed. But the budget of the Foreign Office is equivalent to a mid-sized county council. So I think last time I looked, it was about the same as Kent County Council. Is that really sensible? We have a smaller Foreign Service in Italy, much smaller than France, smaller than Germany. Does it really make sense that we choose to spend less on diplomacy than those countries? Diplomats are very good value for money because when diplomacy works, you avoid things like wars, which are incredibly expensive, off the charts expensive. So we need to remember why diplomacy is worth doing well and spend money on it.
Okay, that's great. Thank you for that. And thank you.
With my podcast partner who's a former ambassador, just trying to playing the easy numbers here.
No, that's really good. And actually, I'm so pleased you mentioned the Global South. We are so focused on the sort of stories that occupy the headlines. And one of the criticisms that is often leveled, not without reason, about, oh, you're always so obsessed about Gaza and the Palestinians. What about South Sudan? Or what about the Burmese struggle? There are whole vast swathes of the world that never get enough attention. I think the three areas that I would like to see us do better is I would like us to be able to spell out a clearer vision of what it is we want to do rather than how. Progressive realism, as I said at the beginning, I find is a nice way that you can pretty much apply to every situation. So it's a clever formula. It's quite a skillful one. It's a classic Foreign Office drafting technique to sort of come up with something that appears to offer something to all sides. But I would like a clearer sense of what we actually truly believe in or sort of see in more substantive terms. So I would like to see that. Linked to that, I would like to see much more proactive communication, joining the dots between international challenges and domestic issues. So, for example, one of the reasons there is so much mass migration and why we face a problem with migrants trying to enter the UK illegally is because the world is unstable, because of climate change, because of unresolved conflicts, because of famine. And so there is a joining the dots there. If we want to try and limit illegal immigration to the UK, it's one of the reasons why we need to be invested overseas. If we want to spend more on our defence, we have to look at the structure of our budgets. It's another reason for looking at our trading relationship with the EU. So that's the other one I would like to see, is a more sort of joined up, coherent narrative. And then the third one I would like to see just relates to the Middle East. I would like us to find some moral backbone here. The UK is no longer a great power in terms of the size of our economy, the size of our armed forces. We are more of a middle-sized power. But I still believe we can be a moral voice because the UK did draft many of these international charters and conventions. We were a leading player in establishing the International Criminal Court. The British legal system is famous. British lawyers are famous. We have a really strong brand in terms of the rule of law. And I think we should speak up for them. We can be that moral voice on the UN Security Council. And I don't think we need to be constantly sort of hedging between here and there. Say what we believe in. So that's going to be my last word on this subject. Do you have any last word, Arthur?
Well, I think very briefly, the challenge is for a country that it is clearly, we are in a transition from having been a globally significant country, and that transition has been going on for a long time. But these things take a while to bed down, to this kind of middle power status, defining what then our national interests are and what it means both to be British, but also what British foreign policy is therefore engaged in, is a very difficult task, and one that it seems very clear has yet really to be achieved.
All right. Well, that's definitely enough from me. It's probably enough from you, Arthur. So thank you very much, everybody, for listening. That's it for this week. If you too want to help order the disorder, please tap follow right now and you'll be notified when every new episode launches.
Yeah, and check our YouTube channel for extra videos that help you order the disorder.
We have so much to offer you. There's also our Substack, and links for that are also in the show notes.
Our producer is George McDonough, and Disorder is part of the Evergreen Network.
Thank you so much for listening, and we wish you a peaceful and orderly week. But I am predicting there is more disorder to come.
Are you tired of starting your day with pointless political arguments, superficial summaries, and lukewarm hot takes on the radio?
Then switch to The Bunker, where we look at the news without the nonsense.
Every weekday morning, The Bunker brings you a brand new, in-depth look at just one story.
From the chaos in Washington to the seismic political shifts in the UK.
To business, economics, history, and pop culture.
Or start your week, our essential Monday morning roundup of the week's upcoming stories.
We cut through the noise to bring you what matters.
That's The Bunker, news without the nonsense, every weekday, with me, Andrew Harrison,
Ross Taylor,
Jacob Jarvis,
Gavin Essler,
Sing Sing,
and me, Seth Jebble.
Find us wherever you get your podcasts.